It was bitterly cold. But the men of Unit 124 had been trained to ignore the pain, and they were good at it. One of their exercises had been to run 4 miles in sub-zero temperatures, after all. With little regard to their frozen limbs, the men snuck past the U.S. guards along one of the most heavily guarded borders on Earth and into South Korea. After traversing rugged mountainsides undetected, they set up camp in a forested area roughly 30 miles from Seoul. Their mission was direct and clear: kill the South Korean president. The men thought that they were sufficiently isolated until they heard 4 frantic voices. 4 brothers were prowling around for firewood, and they found themselves in absolutely the wrong place at absolutely the wrong time. The commandos considered their options. They didn't kill the 4 brothers, partly because the frozen ground would have been digging their graves an arduous task. Instead, they lectured the brothers on the merits of communism. When the brothers feigned allegiance to North Korea, the commandos let them go. They promptly alerted police. By the time police and military had begun hunting for them, Unit 124 had already vanished. They were able to evade capture for 2 days, and on January 21st, 1968, they reached the home of the president, the Blue House. About 10 p.m., wearing South Korean military garb, the men outfoxed the security officers guarding the building. They were within 100 yards of the Blue House when a sentry finally spotted them. The palace grounds erupted in gunfire. The commandos fled in all directions, chased by soldiers. The fight bled into the streets of Seoul, and at the end of the night, over 24 South Koreans died, including civilians. The South Korean army hunted the men for 3 days, killing off as many as they could. In total, 29 of the unit's 31 soldiers were killed. The South Korean president, understandably, was furious, and it was time to retaliate. Enter our story, South Korean Unit 684. In response to the assassination attempt, the South Korean government organized Unit 684, and the men were advised to kill the leader of North Korea. Unit 684 was intentionally modeled after Unit 124, the North Korean assassination squad. That squad had 31 members, and so did Unit 684. They were trained to survive a little frostbite here and there because nothing could stop them from their assassination mission. But unlike the decorated soldiers of the North Korean squad, the men of Unit 684 had little to no military experience. Some sources claim that the men were plucked from death row and offered a chance at redemption. Others claim that the men were vagrants and acrobats. One of the guards described the men as, quote, the kind who would get into street fights a lot, end quote. The training regimen was outlandishly cruel, and 7 men died. At least 1 from just sheer exhaustion. 4 of them attempted to escape the island they were on because they were frustrated with the beatings, the killings, and the poor conditions in the unit, and apparently wanted to alert authorities to their plight. All 4 were beaten to death. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to the men, tensions between the Koreas had been easing. By 1971, a mutual frustration with the U.S. brought warming relations between the Koreas. So, Unit 684 was rendered useless. Well, these men were not happy. Not happy at all that the mission they had trained for over 3 years had suddenly been canceled. They still wanted blood, but now they just didn't care whose blood it was. At 6 a.m. the next morning, the recruits ventured out into the sable-black morning of winter under a waxing crescent. They murdered the first trainer while he was asleep with a swift hammer to the skull. Next, they stole guns and ammo, and using their perfected skills, started slaughtering the trainers, most of whom were still drunk or hungover from the night before. Total, the recruits killed 18 guards, Only 6 survived. Satisfied with their bloodthirst, Unit 684 cleaned the blood from their bodies and carefully dressed in their immaculate uniforms because they were going home. They loaded up a stolen bus with a cache of machine guns, knives, and grenades and made their way towards South Seoul. The commandos could almost see their houses when they were met by a police blockade. Trapped on the bus, it was hopeless. But giving up was not an option for Unit 684. Instead, the men clenched grenades and, in unison, yanked the pins. The blast turned the bus's windows into flying specks, and the stench was nauseating, especially in the heat. The men were scattered in bits and pieces everywhere. Somehow or another, 4 of the men still survived, but not for long. Military police yanked them off the bus on stretchers and then imprisoned them. They were executed by firing squad and then buried secretly in the hills outside of Seoul. Their bodies have never been found. In fact, South Korea only recently acknowledged Unit 684's existence. In 2010, the Seoul Central District Court ruled that the family of Unit 684's recruits were entitled to hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages. North Korea usually comes to mind when we think of a country killing its own citizens. But the Shilmido uprising is an exception. In the Iliad, Homer depicts Ares, the god of war, as a curse on mankind, a kind of supernatural serial killer. In general, the Greeks loathed Ares, often depicting him as a whiny, cowardly, and strange beast. The Romans, however, fawned over Mars, the Roman incarnation of the god of war, majestic, smooth, invincible, often clad in gilded armor as he led men into the battlefield, his very presence making it a field of renown. The story of Unit 684 contains both versions of the mythical god of war. From one angle, the squabbling, bloated, diplomatic mechanisms of war directly caused the death of untold numbers of men and women. War made the Koreas petty. They schemed, and in their cowardice both sides plotted assassins, only to recoil at the last moment. From the other angle, heroism came to life through a band of criminals and misfits, and however misguided, cast a gleaming light over the battlefield as they died. Yet in reality, neither version leaves any survivors.